is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Tholhungba. Production at a pipeline in Michigan is being temporarily halted by a judge because of significant damage to the line and a lack of response by the owners. The leak is affecting the treaty-protected waters of the Bay Mills Indian community. The pipeline is owned by Enbridge. A week ago, the state learned a 4-mile segment was leaking. That portion crosses under the Straits of Mackinac. Enbridge did not comply with the state's request for information and also refused to provide information to the Bay Mills tribe and other tribes. In his decision, the judge wrote that the severe risk of harm that may result is so substantial and irreparable and endangers so many communities, the danger far exceeds the risk of financial loss to the defendants. The state is still waiting for the decision on a preliminary injunction regarding the pipeline. That decision could come by next Tuesday. While many statues of Christopher Columbus continue to come down across the nation, New York City is using taxpayer dollars to protect them. The NYPD has set up barricades around the statues of Columbus at Columbus Circle and in Central Park. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and Mayor Bill de Blasio are both Italian descent, like Columbus, and have voiced support for allowing the statues to remain.
I don't believe in any kind of vandalism, and I don't know what Christopher Columbus would have to do with any of the demonstrations that are going on today. And it just doesn't make sense to ruin something that is basically a beautiful statue.
People were galvanized to tear down the monuments of oppressive historical figures after the death of George Floyd on May 25th.
I think, in my opinion, this one should be taken down along with the other ones. Honestly, in my honest opinion. That's like, I can't speak for other people, but that's how I feel about it.
At first, protesters vandalized and removed statues themselves. Many cities are now choosing to remove them to avoid vandalism and violence. Native Americans in Chicago are dying at alarmingly high rates. And according to a story in the Daily Northwestern, the city is choosing to hide those statistics. The interim executive director for the American Indian Health Service of Chicago, Roxanne Yunabia, says 23% of the clinic's COVID-19 tests are positive. That's 7.5% higher than the overall rate in Chicago. They also found the mortality rate among American Indians and Alaska Natives is at nearly 15%, while the city total percent is at 5%. 27,000 Native Americans live in Chicago, according to census data. Less than 1% of natives there tested between March and June 9th, while 9% of Chicago's overall population was tested during that same period. And now for an update on COVID-19 numbers in Indian country, let's go to our Washington editor, Jordan Benebigay. Jordan?
Yate Patty, Yate Shikisto Shidine. We've been tracking the COVID-19 cases and deaths in Indian country for 14 and a half weeks now. And the cases in Native communities seem to be on a similar trend as America, more cases. Here are the latest numbers from our database. There are 11,367 positive cases and 463 deaths in the Indian health system. Again, that is a total of 11,367 positive cases and 463 deaths as of June 26. The Cherokee Nation Oklahoma announced 6 more cases, giving the tribe a total of 175 cases. The White Mountain Apache tribe in Arizona announced 48 new cases and 1 additional death. They have a total of 1,619 cases and 21 deaths now. The Hopi tribe earlier this week reported a total of 253 positive tests, and that is 156 tests since June 2nd for the tribe. And the Navajo Nation saw an increase of 121 new cases and 1 more death. The Navajo Nation President Jonathan Nez calls the increase in cases alarming and attributes it to the increase in testing by the nation. However, around the country, experts are saying this increase of cases due to Americans being lax on preventative measures while the economy is slowly reopening. And even the World Health Organization is saying the pandemic is, quote, getting worse. Cases around the world are nearing 9.5 million with approximately 500,000 deaths. And while COVID cases may be increasing in tribes and around the world, some tribes are still virus-free, such as the Blackfeet Nation, Montana, Makah tribe of Washington State, and the native village of Nulato in Alaska.
So there's some good news in all of this COVID pandemic here, Jordan Bennett Begay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And we'll be right back.
This is Indian Country Today.
Welcome back. It's Friday and our Reporters Roundtable, and today we're going to look at how the coronavirus pandemic is affecting the wildfire season. How will fire camps operate when the troops are called out to a forest fire? Also in New Mexico, there's a showdown brewing between tribes and the governor over an education bill. Joining us today to talk about these stories they are reporting on are Sean Griswold, and he's a reporter for the New Mexico In-Depth. His beat includes education and child welfare. Welcome, Sean.
Hello, nice to be here.
Also joining us is Brian Bull, and Brian is a general assignment reporter for KLCC in Eugene, Oregon. Welcome, Brian.
Tots my way, Patty. Good to be here.
Well, let's start with you, Brian, because we're already seeing brush fires in Arizona and some other states, and June is the start of the wildfire, forest fire season. How are tribes in your area preparing for this fire season while also dealing with this highly contagious coronavirus?
Well, we've got a lot of tribes that have already started boot camps this past week, Patty, and what we're seeing is operations as normal as you can possibly make it under the shadow of the pandemic. But in the sources I've talked to, including the Confederated Tribes, the Grand Ronde, there is certainly an air of caution. For instance, a boot camp that would normally last about 5 days has been cut down to 3 days. Social distancing, masks, just general awareness of not sharing materials and items have been emphasized. There's also guidance coming in from a number of agencies. I have here just one example. This is from the Interior Department on basically trying to address wildfires and COVID-19 simultaneously. So you could argue that it is definitely a two-front war that firefighters are fighting this year. And the other things that I've heard from a number of incident commanders is that they are also removing incident management from fire camps. They're going to be kind of in a satellite system. And also a lot of firefighters are going to be grouped in pods, so to speak. I'm going to say probably in groups of 5 or 6 individuals that will not break apart and integrate themselves with other groups. So it's going to be pretty insular. There's going to be a lot of emphasis on hygiene. There's also going to be shortened training. I've been told by a number of sources that if you were a firefighter last year or years past, you're pretty much grandfathered in as far as the training goes. New recruits are welcome, of course, but a lot of that training is now going to be virtual as well as shortened.
It's hard to wrap your head around how they're going to do that because just the nature of the work, they are in very tight quarters, not just when they're fighting the fire, but also when they're sleeping back at base camp. So I just can't imagine how they're going to be able to social distance and yet battle a forest fire effectively. Sean, you also have experience covering firefighters in your previous job in Colorado. What have you seen that would raise some concerns and what you would have questions about?
I think ultimately the biggest question I would have is how are you going to provide safety for firefighters that have to live in close quarters? Social distancing, while being a requirement and a recommendation, when you're outside and when you're in that close with that many people, it's almost impossible to social distance. And so ultimately, I would want to understand the overall public health of the people who are on the front lines in that area. and ensuring that there's going to be enough quality trained individuals to continue to work these fires if there's an outbreak. And unfortunately, what the response will be from that to be able to adjust crews to fires that are going to be needing more people, especially if some of those people and those crew members are are lost because of the illness for any period of time. And so I think that's, to me, is the biggest thing to understand is how do you enforce and how do you even direct social distancing in an area that doesn't allow for it.
And Brian, did they talk about how, I mean, all the CDC guidelines are don't touch your eyes, don't touch your nose, your mouth, but that's what you do when you're on a fire. I mean, you're sweating profusely. And so you're going to wipe your brow, wipe your eyes, all of that, everything that they're telling us not to do, they do that because of the nature of their work. How are they handling that?
I think they just have to rely on people using their best judgment and common sense, and also a sense of making sure that they are protecting themselves and others from any potential outbreaks. I did talk to one source with the Douglas Fire Protective Association, which handles a lot of the fires. I think 1.6 million acres falls under their jurisdiction. And he acknowledged that it's going to be very, very hard when you have firefighters out on the line, having to oftentimes work in very tight quarters, having to share the same equipment, hoses, tools, Pulaskis, and then also be transported in relatively tight quarters too, such as trucks or vans. So one thing I was told, though, is that they are revisiting transportation of fire crews. During an average fire season, it's not unusual to see fire crews trucked in from other states, even other countries. We've had firefighters come in from as far away as Canada and Australia to participate in the firefighting here in the Pacific Northwest. But that is one thing they're going to be monitoring, is making sure that they're not trucking in people from potentially contaminated areas where they may be bringing in firefighters who have COVID-19. The other thing that they are really emphasizing too is that, I guess you can call it an honor system, if you will. Firefighting is a very lucrative line of work. I know that, believe it or not, I used to be a firefighter temporarily about 30 years and 30 pounds ago for the National Park Service. And it paid well. There was a sense of duty and adventure, and it's a very reliable line of work. We have wildfires every year. But at the same time, they want to emphasize that if you feel like you're coming down with a fever or any other signs that could be potentially COVID-19, to report yourself. And they're going to say, they've told me that there's going to be a health technician at a lot of fire camps. Isolate yourself and do not put your teammates at risk. It would be a very difficult thing to do, of course, because you want to be on the lines, you are making good money, and you're helping, protect, residents in the environment. But at the same time, you could be potentially coming down with something that could endanger an entire camp if it's allowed to spread.
Do you think that's enough to ask people to just identify? I mean, because I'm just thinking again, that culture, there's, these are really rough and tough people who can get out there, carry all that equipment, run long distances and battle a fire. So there's a certain amount of attitude with that. And do you think that people will step back and say, you know what, I don't feel well today. I've got a little fever. I'm starting to, my throat is itchy or whatever. Is that reliable? Did the person you spoke to, did they say that was reliable?
That is an excellent question. And I think that's going to fall on every individual to kind of assume that responsibility. I think there is a very tough attitude that firefighters have, and rightfully so. It's very grueling work. And to feel like you may have to step back because you're not sure whether that high temperature necessarily means COVID-19 or just that you're overworked and underhydrated is going to be a very demanding test. I think as far as health and federal officials and state officials go, they're just going to really try to emphasize education and self-awareness and consideration for your team if you start exhibiting possible signs.
Yes. And then the other aspect, once they come back into camp, I read in one of your stories about how they're changing the food line. And, for firefighters, that food is really important because they have to bulk up and they have to just eat as much as they can because they burn so many calories on the fire line. But what are the changes that they're doing in the chow hall?
The biggest change we're going to see, Patty, is we're going to see the removal of the standing buffet line. It's a very common feature at fire camps in years past to simply line up and wait your turn and get served cafeteria style. You hold out your tray and you get your food. But now they're going to make all those meals individually and pre-packaged. And so they're going to remove that communal experience so that firefighters simply grab their box, hopefully stand 6 feet apart from each other, and enjoy their meal to fuel up. So that is going to be another adjustment that firefighters are going to face this year.
Yeah, again, you know, as someone who's also covered firefighters or forest fires, it's just hard to imagine how they can do that, because we're talking about tight quarters. You know, they don't have. I mean, they set up tents, and that alone will restrict how many people can be in there at any one time. But along with that is just the nature of the work of smoke, and how the virus can be carried on smoke, whether it's cigarette smoke or, in this case, smoke from a forest fire. Did they talk about that? Any kind of concern of the virus spreading even more if somebody there is infected?
The two elements that I remember from my reporting involving smoke was, one, that wildfire smoke contains small particles, particulate matter, that can agitate underlying health conditions. And so firefighters kind of have that risk at hand that if they come down with COVID-19 and they have to breathe in that wildfire smoke, that will be double jeopardy, if you will. If they cannot contain wildfire smoke too, that may drift into communities where people have pre-existing conditions such as lung and heart disease. Their health may be further compromised. And that includes many Native communities. As we've seen with COVID-19, there is a concern that communities of color, indigenous populations, through a number of factors, may already face a greater risk of COVID-19 than non-Indian populations. The other thing that I've heard too regarding smoke is that tobacco is a very common staple for a lot of Native people, either for personal reasons. We see it done as habits, but we also see it done for spiritual or sacred reasons. And the sharing of tobacco is something that tobacco is a very common practice. But if guidelines are being issued that people should not be sharing tobacco, then that may limit, I think, a very cultural tradition among our people that will have to be done out of safety reasons.
All right. So again, and there are 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon that are in these positions of watching out for these forest fires. So we'll come back to you in just a minute, Brian, but thank you. Now we'll turn to New Mexico, where in this pandemic, the governor has been working very hard with tribes to ensure that they get some funding and they get the attention they need to battle this pandemic. But on the educational side, there is some controversy. Sean, can you tell us a little bit give us some background on the Yazzie Martinez case?
Yeah, so the Yazzie Martinez case is a landmark education decision. It was, the opinion came from Judge Sarah Singleton in 2018. And she ruled that New Mexico's education system was unconstitutional, and it was providing inadequate education for English learning students, Native American students, at-risk students in poverty, and students with special needs. And that included classroom instruction, curriculum that was culturally relevant. The state was found in violation of the Indian Education Act, the State Indian Education Act that New Mexico had enacted in 2013. And there was just a whole widespread of systemic issues that was resulted in the foundation of New Mexico's public education system that was not properly serving these students, creating a huge education gap that has consistently placed New Mexico public education anywhere around 50 to 45% ranked in the nation, And so when that decision was made, it was a court injunction that mandated that the state of New Mexico has to provide not only adequate funding for these community populations, but also curriculum-based instruction that is not only in multiple languages, dual languages, especially have English-speaking section, but also traditional languages for Native American students, and providing the resources and the funding to ensure that not only is the curriculum relevant to the cultural of the tribes, but also has been expanded to provide just greater education opportunities for these students. So 2019 was the first year that the state of New Mexico was to fall into guidance with this order. That was also the first year that New Mexico's Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham took office. And in her first special session, she did an incredible amount of education initiatives. Education was one of her major campaign goals in being elected. So out of her first session as governor, one of her very first executive orders was to replace the standardized testing model, which was controversial for a number of reasons. And so she's using that as an argument now in a case to dismiss the injunction of and the guidelines and mandate through Yazzie Martinez. She's also highlighting in her motion to dismiss the funding model and the amount of funding that has gone to education in New Mexico. Since she took office, New Mexico has seen almost $400 million in education spending increases for the state of New Mexico, about 18% addition to the budget. So right now, New Mexico's education is more than half the state budget. And that's important to note because New Mexico recently had to do a special session to basically do a solvency bill. In January, New Mexico meets for its legislature, and that's when they pass their budget. The budget this January was passed with the largest budget in state history, $7.7 billion. And that was when the state was flush in oil and gas revenue, had a lot of alternatives to be able to spend money and to spend it and to target some of these populations. Then COVID hit. And so the state has to deal with up to $2 billion in revenue shortfall. And that was what the special session solvency bill was. Now, the state cut $700 million in spending last week when they passed their solvency bill. $200 million of that was in education spending. Now, the concern right now is for advocates who are, one, hoping that Yazzie Martinez guidelines are still going to be followed for this upcoming school year, is that the education initiatives for dual language programs, for mentorship programs, for extended learning programs, for programs that have been tied to support the education needs and the goals of the student population that hasn't been met before, is that they saw a reduction in funding. Now, everything across the board in New Mexico saw a reduction in funding with this new bill. So nothing was immune to it. But then you look at some programs in particular, there was a curriculum initiative for multicultural curriculum. That was expected to see a $8 million increase in spending. $8 million increase in spending. That was cut. So instead of the $9 million, this program that was going to provide a culturally relevant and language curriculum for Native American students, English learning students, is going to be down to $1 million in the budget. And so for this upcoming school year, the concern is will these education initiatives continue to stay funded? And then looking towards January, where depending on what happens with the motion to this Yazzie case, what support will New Mexico provide for these students? Now, the honest behind this whole motion of the dismissal from the governor's office is essentially to remove accountability from and oversight from the court. The governor wants to be able to provide her own initiatives for these students, which she has highlighted in 3 areas in her motion to dismiss, one being education funding, one being pragmatic changes, which is including she's increased the amount of administration tribal liaisons and built a stronger relationship between the state and tribal schools. And so with those efforts, she feels that that the state is now in guidance with the directions of the injunction from Yazzie Martinez. Now, but
clearly the tribes are not in agreement with that. And they said they were blindsided in the middle of fighting COVID when they were working so well with the governor. Now this
is definitely a surprise from the tribes. Every tribal leadership from Navajo Nation to the Mescalero Apache, the Apache Band tribes, as well as every governor from the Pueblos in New Mexico are opposed to this motion to dismiss the Yazzie Martinez case. Their concern is that without accountability and without any court oversight, there's no guarantee that the state of New Mexico will adhere to the education initiatives that have already shown some progress for those students that I listed before. And so without that court oversight, they just don't know if these education initiatives will remain a priority or if they'll change with another administration that were to come in. So for them, that protection from the court is very essential to maintain the education initiatives, especially with what's going on with COVID-19. When
Well, a
schools
lot's going on. And then Monday, or is it next week, Tuesday, is the hearing?
So the hearing is going to be on Monday. It's going to be 1 o'clock Mountain Time in 1 o'clock. It's a 4-hour hearing. You're going to hear 4 motions in the case, but the major motion being from the state of New Mexico filing a motion to get out of this case and to dismiss the case.
All right. Well, we will continue to follow that and along with your reporting. Sean Griswold, thank you so much with New Mexico In Depth. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Brian Bull with KLCC, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
And thank you for watching. Remember, take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Thalahungba. Have a safe weekend. We'll see you on Monday.
This is Indian Country Today.